Heading into a church, a vampire disguised himself as a beggar. On his neck, he'd applied a strange, alluring perfume. The moment the nuns caught the scent, they completely lost control, drawn to him, kneeling at his feet, desperate to offer themselves to the creature. This fragrance had the terrifying power to strip away reason, turning anyone into a helpless puppet under the vampire's will. But this wasn't just any monster. This being had wandered the earth for over 400 years, endlessly searching for the soul of his lost beloved. Back in the year 1480 in Eastern Europe, Prince Vladimir ruled a prosperous kingdom. He lived in peace and happiness with his wife, Elizabeth. Yet the world was plagued by wars and devastation, forcing Vladimir to lead his army into battle himself. The front lines were on the brink of all-out war. As the prince fought with unmatched fury, tragedy struck back home. Elizabeth was ambushed. When the fighting finally ceased and night cloaked the battlefield in fire and ash, Vladimir stood atop a mountain, his enemy's head still impaled on his arrow. Victory was his. But that triumph quickly turned to heartbreak when he learned of Elizabeth's fate. She had fled on horseback across a snow-covered plain littered with bear traps. Her horse was caught and her ankle was brutally crushed by the iron jaws. By the time Vladimir arrived, it was too late. His beloved was gone. Devastated beyond measure, Vladimir cursed God in his despair and rage, renouncing his faith. In that moment, a dark curse took hold. The prince was transformed into an immortal vampire, condemned to an eternity of loneliness, sorrow, and endless night. Centuries passed. Now, it was the 19th century in London. Dr. Dumont led a priest through the halls of an asylum. They made their way down a chaotic corridor, descending into a cold, lightless basement. There, locked away, was a young woman named Maria, 25 years old, from Bologna, Italy. She was supposed to marry Henry William Spencer, the Parisian consul. The ceremony was planned to take place at her family estate, since priest, a scholar from an ancient order that had hunted vampires for over 400 years, sensed the truth. Rather than fear, his curiosity burned brighter than ever. He explained that vampires can endure normal light, but direct sunlight is fatal. To prove it, he threw open the window. Maria screamed in agony as the sunlight seared her skin, leaving scorched patches across her body. When a crucifix was brought near, it spontaneously burst into flames. The priest then took Dumont's young assistant, cut his wrist, and offered the fresh blood to Maria. She drank, trembling, and the priest examined her like a farmer inspecting livestock. On her neck, he found the telltale bite marks. Maria was no pure-blood vampire, but one who had been turned. For centuries, the Vatican had searched for the origin of these creatures, yet Maria refused to name her master. She only whispered that he was a prince, a man searching endlessly for his princess. Soon after, the priest found Henry, Maria's fiancé, and asked to visit her former room. Carefully, he began to investigate every corner. Finally, inside one of Maria's old books, the priest discovered a torn page. Meanwhile, far away, a young lawyer named Jonathan was traveling by carriage to a remote ancient castle. As he prepared to step out, the coachman stopped him and insisted he take a string of crucifixes for protection. Jonathan found the gesture odd, but didn't think much of it. He grabbed his briefcase and entered the castle to handle some business on behalf of his client. Then, out of the shadows, a gaunt, white-haired old man appeared. Jonathan quickly introduced himself. "I'm Jonathan, a new associate from the Filippo firm in Paris." The old man's lips curled slightly. "Just call me Count Dracula," he replied. In that instant, it became clear. This count was none other than Prince Vladimir, the cursed immortal himself. Jonathan followed Dracula into the dining hall, where the flickering candlelight finally offered a glimpse of the surroundings. A grand feast was laid out across the table, yet Dracula had no intention of eating. As Jonathan spoke, he rummaged through his bag for the proper documents, unaware that Dracula had picked up a small mouse from the table and squeezed its blood into a wine glass before taking a slow sip. Jonathan continued talking, explaining that the French government planned to convert the monastery into a hospital, predicting it would soon attract millions of visitors. But mid-conversation, Jonathan's crucifix slipped from his neck and clattered to the floor. Dracula's eyes immediately locked onto it. With a mere flick of his finger, the crucifix flew across the room and landed straight into the fireplace, bursting into flames. Before Jonathan could react, Dracula vanished in a blur. That evening, ignoring Dracula's warning entirely, Jonathan grabbed a kerosene lamp and began to explore the castle's dark corridors. Eventually, he stumbled upon a hidden staircase leading down to a secret basement. In the center of the cold stone chamber stood an enormous coffin. Driven by curiosity, Jonathan lifted the lid to take a look inside. A chilling voice echoed through the air. "You should not have left your room." The next thing Jonathan knew, everything went black. When he regained consciousness, he found himself bound in iron chains, hanging helplessly as three monstrous figures crouched in front of him. With a simple wave of his hand, Dracula lifted Jonathan into the air, dangling him upside down so that the blood began to rush to his head. The Count extended a razor-sharp claw and sliced Jonathan's arm open. One of the creatures quickly held a basin beneath him to collect the dripping blood. Dracula looked into Jonathan's terrified eyes and asked with a cold smile, "Do you have any last wishes before you die?" To his surprise, Jonathan took a shaky breath and answered, "I want to hear your story." Dracula slowly lowered Jonathan back to the ground and began to speak in a low, solemn voice. "I was once God's most loyal servant," he said, "but he took away my beloved wife and even stripped me of the right to die." He explained that despite his curse, he had always believed that a pure soul could be reborn, reincarnated into a new body. And so for the past 400 years, he had never given up his desperate search for Elizabeth's soul. Throughout those centuries, the wings of death had spread their shadow across Europe. Nearly 200 million souls had perished, half of them women. Yet most of these women had been reborn within the church, making Dracula's mission nearly impossible. He had wandered across the world like a lost spirit, drifting through the ages without rest. Again and again, he tried to end his cursed life, but no matter what he attempted, death refused to claim him. Time wore on, and slowly, even his desires began to fade, including his longing for death itself. Over the span of more than a century, Dracula devoted himself entirely to research. Finally, he succeeded. He created a special perfume, one unlike anything the world had ever known. To craft it, he first traveled to the great city of Baghdad, seeking rare ingredients from its magical gardens that bloomed with thousands of mystical flowers. Then he journeyed to Kannauj, India, where he studied the ancient art of capturing the soul of a flower, the very essence of its spirit. Finally, he returned to Europe, harvesting nectar from the lavender fields of Grasse, France. He brought it all to Florence, Italy, the heart of the perfume world, where a master artisan helped him finish his creation. The result was both beautiful and horrifying, a perfume with supernatural power. Its scent could seize control of any soul, turning people into prisoners of their own senses, puppets dancing on invisible strings, their every movement dictated by Dracula's will. But even visiting every royal court across Europe, he still hadn't found Elizabeth. In one final effort, he traveled to the Palace of Versailles in France. The king had gathered the greatest nobles, artists, and beauties of the land there, and Dracula believed that if Elizabeth's soul had truly been reborn, she would surely appear among them. And then, he saw her. The face he had longed for across centuries appeared before him at last, but it was only her face. The woman carried none of Elizabeth's soul, none of her warmth, none of her light. The realization struck Dracula like lightning. Everything, the centuries of searching, the endless sacrifices, the oceans of gold and blood, had been nothing but an illusion. Consumed by fury, Dracula lost control. In a violent rage, he transformed everyone present, cursing them to serve him. He gave them a single mission: find Elizabeth's soul. Among those transformed was Maria. But, as expected, their search ended in failure. Elizabeth's body had long since turned to dust, not even her bones remained. From that day on, Dracula withdrew from the world. He rarely left his castle, choosing instead to hide in its shadows, waiting endlessly, hoping that one day his disciples would bring him the news he longed for, that his beloved had finally been found. After listening to Dracula's haunting tale, Jonathan spoke softly, trying to reason with him. He said, "Since you understand love so deeply, please spare my life." He explained that before coming to the castle, he had just proposed to the woman he loved, and they had promised to marry as soon as he returned home. Intrigued, Dracula leaned closer and asked, "What does your fiancée look like?" Jonathan replied that he carried her photo inside the locket around his neck. At Dracula's signal, one of the small monsters tore the locket from Jonathan's throat and handed it to their master. Dracula opened it. Inside was the face he had haunted his dreams for centuries, the woman he had searched for across time itself. It was Elizabeth. Dracula stared at the photo in disbelief. Then from deep within his chest, he let out a bone-chilling wail, a sound filled with centuries of longing and pain. This woman, she was his beloved reborn.